She was 19 years old, and for all intents and purposes, an orphan left to the cold mercies of a world that had already taken her mother. Her stepfather's family had cast her out with nothing more than the clothes on her back, a worn carpet bag, and a single $5 bill. With that, and a faded scrap of deerskin clutched in her hand, she walked away from the settlement of Flat Creek and followed an old trail into the Bitterroot Mountains. But what nobody knew, what her mother had carefully hidden from a dismissive world, was that the trail did not lead to an end, but to a beginning, waiting for her in the deep quiet of a mountain cave. Settle in and listen close, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. This is the story of Clara Winslow. Clara's world had always been small, defined by the scent of wood smoke, lye soap, and the damp wool of other people's lives. Her mother, Eleanor Winslow, was the laundress for the small Montana settlement of Flat Creek, a woman whose existence was measured in the stacks of clean, folded linens she returned to the miners, the blacksmith, and the storekeeper's wife. To the town, Eleanor was a quiet fixture, tireless and uncomplaining, a widow who had married the widower Silas Croft, more for the security of a roof than for any illusion of affection. They saw a plain woman with chapped hands and a perpetually weary slope to her shoulders, and they saw nothing more. But Clara saw the truth. She saw the keen intelligence in her mother's eyes as she watched the evening sky, predicting a frost that would save a neighbor's fledgling garden. She felt the deliberate strength in her hands, not just from scrubbing clothes, but from the way she could set a snare, split kindling with a single, precise strike, and stitch a wound as cleanly as any doctor. Eleanor was a woman who had learned the hard lessons of self-reliance and had passed them on to her daughter not as chores, but as scripture. Every lesson was a verse in the gospel of survival. "The world doesn't owe you softness, Clara," she would say, her voice low as they salted fish by the creek. "But it will give you what you need if you know how to look." So Clara learned. She learned which mushrooms were a meal and which were a grave. She learned to read the stories left in mud and snow by deer and elk. She learned the quiet patience of mending, her stitches becoming as small and even as her mother's, a skill that taught her to fix what was broken rather than discard it. Her mother was her only true mentor, a silent teacher who communicated more in the shared work of their days than in spoken words. And their most precious secret, the one thing that belonged only to them, was a small, soft piece of deerskin. On it, Eleanor had drawn a map in charcoal and berry juice, a winding line that started at the oldest pine tree behind their cabin and disappeared into the jagged blue lines that represented the mountains. "This is our secret way home," Eleanor had told her one evening, folding the deerskin and placing it in Clara's hand. "If you ever need a place that's only yours, you follow this." Clara never understood what she meant. Not really, but she treasured the object. It was a tangible piece of her mother's love, a promise of a place beyond the hard life in Flat Creek, a life made harder by her stepfather, Silas. Silas Croft was a man hollowed out by disappointments, and he filled the space with a simmering resentment. He had married Eleanor for her industry, expecting a silent servant, and he treated Clara as a consequence of that bargain, an extra mouth to feed. His two grown sons, Jeb and Thomas, inherited their father's narrowness of spirit and saw Clara as an unwelcome ghost in their home, a reminder that their father's house had once belonged to another man, her father, who had died in a mining collapse years before Eleanor married Silas. They tolerated her presence as long as her mother was alive, her labor a vital part of the household's meager economy. But when the winter fever came, swift and merciless, and took Eleanor in the space of 3 days, that tolerance evaporated like frost in the morning sun. The end of Clara's life in Flat Creek did not come with a storm of anger or a dramatic confrontation. It arrived quietly, a week after her mother was buried in the frozen ground of the settlement's small cemetery. The air in the cabin was thick with a new kind of silence, no longer the companionable quiet of shared work, but the empty, sterile silence of absence. Silas sat at the head of the rough-hewn table, his sons Jeb and Thomas on either side, their faces set in the grim, practical lines of men about to conduct a piece of unpleasant business. Clara stood by the hearth, her mother's woolen shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, the last lingering scent of her clinging to the fibers. Silas cleared his throat, a dry, rasping sound. "Clara," he began, not looking at her, "your ma is gone. We're sorry for it. But things are what they are." He gestured vaguely around the small room. "This cabin, the land, it's mine now. There's no inheritance to speak of. Your mother brought nothing into this marriage but her own 2 hands." It was a lie, of course. The cabin had been her father's, but Eleanor, a woman alone, had signed it over to Silas upon their marriage for the sake of propriety and protection. A piece of paper had erased her history. "We're simple men," Jeb added, his voice flat. "We can't afford to keep another person who ain't our blood. There ain't enough work or food to go around." Thomas, the younger and somehow crueler of the two, simply pushed a small, worn carpet bag across the floor with the toe of his boot. "Ma's things are in there," he grunted. What little there was. Silas finally met her gaze, his own eyes holding no malice, only a profound and weary indifference. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a few coins and a folded bill, placing them on the table. "This is $5, he said, the words falling like stones into the quiet room. "It's more than we can spare, but it'll see you to the next town. You're a hard worker. You'll find a place." Clara looked from his face to the money on the table and then to the bag at her feet. She did not cry. She did not plead or argue. Her mother had taught her that begging only deepens the humiliation. Dignity was in the straightness of your spine, in the quiet way you accepted the inevitable and moved on. She walked to the table, picked up the $5, and tucked it into her pocket. She bent down and lifted the carpet bag, its weight familiar and sorrowful in her hand. Inside, she knew, would be her mother's spare dress, her brush, a small book of psalms, and the sewing kit that had mended half the town's clothes. She turned back to the 3 men, who were already looking away, their duty done, their consciences, such as they were, clear. Her gaze swept the cabin one last time. The stone hearth she and her mother had swept 1,000 times. The narrow bed she had shared with her. The window that looked out onto the woods. There was nothing left for her here. Without another word, she opened the cabin door and stepped out into the cold, thin air of the Montana spring. The door clicked shut behind her, a sound of absolute finality. She did not look back. She clutched the bag in one hand, and with the other, she reached into the deep pocket of her skirt and felt for the soft, folded square of deerskin. Her mother's map. Her secret way home. The path away from Flat Creek was not a road, but a memory. Clara walked north, leaving the muddy track that led to the next settlement and turning instead toward the dark line of timber that marked the beginning of the mountains. She walked with a steady, unhurried pace, a rhythm her mother had taught her for covering long distances without exhausting oneself. The carpet bag was awkward, its handle digging into her palm, but she shifted it from hand to hand, refusing to let its burden slow her. The air was sharp and clean, smelling of pine needles and thawing earth. The sun, when it broke through the clouds, was a pale, watery yellow, offering little warmth. She followed the creek that gave the settlement its name, its water running high and fast with melted snow, the sound a constant, rushing companion. For the first few hours, the landscape was familiar. The woods she had foraged in with her mother since she was a small child. She recognized the stand of birch trees where they gathered bark for tinder, the mossy boulder shaped like a sleeping bear, the clearing where wild strawberries grew in the summer. Each landmark was a fresh pang of grief, a reminder of the life that had been so brutally amputated. But as the day wore on, the terrain began to change. The ground grew steeper, the trees taller and thicker, casting the forest floor in a deep, perpetual twilight. She was entering the true wilderness now, the vast, untamed expanse of the Bitterroot Range. Here, the trail was no longer a path worn by habit, but a series of subtle signs her mother had taught her to read. She consulted the deerskin map, its markings a cryptic language only she could understand. A notch carved into the trunk of a towering spruce, weathered and silvered with age. 3 flat stones stacked one atop the other near a game trail. A lightning-scarred pine whose broken top pointed exactly northeast. These were the signposts of her journey, a secret correspondence between a mother and daughter across the Vale of Death. As evening approached, a cold wind began to sweep down from the high peaks, carrying the threat of a late spring snow. Clara felt the familiar ache of fatigue settle into her bones, her hunger a dull, persistent knot in her stomach. She knew she had to find shelter. She left the faint trail and scrambled down a short, steep embankment to the edge of the creek. There, tucked beneath an overhanging granite ledge, was a space just large enough for her to shelter from the wind. It was a place her mother had shown her once, years ago. "Always look for the land's kindness," she had said. "A rock that blocks the wind, a dry patch under a great tree. The mountain will care for you if you let it." Clara gathered dry leaves and pine needles, creating a small, insulated bed against the cold rock. She ate a piece of hard bread she had saved from her last meal at the cabin, chewing it slowly, making it last. She drank deeply from the icy, pure water of the creek. She did not build a fire, not wanting to draw the attention of predators, animal or human. Huddled under her mother's shawl, she watched the stars emerge, impossibly bright and close in the clear mountain air. There was a profound loneliness in the vast, indifferent silence of the mountains. But there was also a strange comfort. Out here, she was not an outcast or a burden. She was simply a living creature, subject to the same rules as the deer and the hawk. Find food, find shelter, endure. Her grief was a heavy stone inside her, but her mother's lessons were the muscles that allowed her to carry it. She slept fitfully, waking to the distant howl of a wolf and the rustle of some small creature in the undergrowth. But fear was a luxury she could not afford. She had a destination. She had a map. And for the first time since her mother's death, she had a purpose beyond simple survival. She was going home. The next day, and the day after that, the journey continued. The terrain grew more rugged, the trail a mere whisper on the landscape. She crossed rushing streams on fallen logs, her feet numb with cold. She climbed steep, scree-covered slopes, her lungs burning, her hands raw from gripping rock and root. The carpet bag became an impossible burden, and she finally stopped, opened it, and made a hard choice. She kept the sewing kit, her mother's brush, and the shawl. The rest, the dress, the psalm book, she wrapped carefully in oilcloth and buried beneath the roots of an ancient cedar, marking the spot. She fashioned a small bundle she could tie to her back, freeing her hands. She was lighter now, moving more easily through the dense forest. She ate wild onions and the tender shoots of spring plants, her hunger abating. She was becoming part of the mountain, her senses sharpening, her body hardening to the demands of the wilderness. Finally, on the afternoon of the fourth day, she saw it. A landmark from the deerskin map she had been searching for. A waterfall, a shimmering curtain of white water cascading down a sheer rock face, its roar filling the small canyon. According to the map, her destination was near. The waterfall was more beautiful and more powerful than the simple drawing on the deerskin could convey. It thundered into a deep, turquoise pool, sending a perpetual mist into the air that clung to the moss-covered rocks and nourished the ferns growing in every crevice. Clara stood for a long moment, the cool spray on her face washing away the dust and fatigue of her journey. The map showed a small symbol just behind the waterfall, a circle that meant shelter or home in the private language she and her mother had shared. Her heart pounded with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Taking a deep breath, she picked her way carefully along the slippery edge of the pool, moving toward the rock face. The space behind the falls was narrow, a slick, wet ledge barely wide enough for her feet. She pressed herself flat against the cold stone, the roar of the water deafening, its force a tangible pressure against her body. She edged along, inch by inch, until she was fully behind the curtain of water. And there it was, not a wide-open entrance, but a dark, narrow fissure in the rock, almost completely concealed by the cascade. It was an opening that no one would ever find by accident. She squeezed through the crack and found herself in sudden, profound silence. The roar of the waterfall was instantly muffled, becoming a distant, rhythmic rumble. She was in a small, dry antechamber. A few more steps took her around a bend in the rock, and the passage opened into a large, high-ceilinged cavern. A pale, ethereal light filtered down from a natural fissure high above, illuminating a space that was not a raw, wild cave, but a carefully prepared refuge. This was the acquisition. This was the home her mother had promised. Against one wall, a neat stack of firewood, dry and seasoned, reached nearly to the ceiling. Next to it sat a small, pot-bellied stove, its stovepipe expertly fitted into a natural chimney in the rock. There were two simple wooden cots with thick wool blankets folded neatly upon them. A rough-hewn table and two stools stood in the center of the cavern floor. Shelves carved into the rock itself held an astonishing array of supplies: sacks of flour, beans, and oats sealed in tin-lined wooden crates to protect them from moisture and rodents. Jars of preserved berries and dried apples, tins of lard and coffee, smoked and salted strips of jerky hanging from hooks. It was a larder stocked for a long winter, a testament to years of patient, secret labor. On another set of shelves, she found tools: an axe, a saw, a hammer, a box of nails, fishing line and hooks, a good rifle with a box of ammunition, and a set of well-cared-for skinning knives. This was more than a shelter. It was a fully equipped homestead, hidden away from the world. Clara walked through the space in a daze, running her hand over the smooth, worn wood of the table, touching the soft wool of the blankets. Every object was evidence of her mother's foresight, her quiet, fierce love. She had been preparing this place for years, creating a sanctuary, a fallback for a future she must have feared. For Clara. Overwhelmed, she sank onto one of the cots, the rough blanket a comforting weight. The grief she had held so tightly in her chest finally broke free, not in a storm of sobs, but in quiet, steady tears that rolled down her cheeks and dripped onto her dusty clothes. They were tears not just of sorrow, but of a profound, heart-aching gratitude. She was not abandoned. She had never been abandoned. Her mother had seen the cruelty in Silas and his sons, had understood the precariousness of their life, and had built this ark in secret, a haven against the coming flood. Eleanor Winslow had not been a simple laundress. She had been a survivor, a planner, a protector, and this cave was her final, greatest gift to her daughter. After the first wave of emotion passed, a deep sense of purpose settled over Clara. This place was not just a refuge, it was a responsibility. She spent the next few days taking inventory, familiarizing herself with the intricate, hidden world her mother had built. She found a spring of fresh, cold water trickling from the back wall of the cave, channeled by a series of small, carefully placed stones into a stone basin. She found a collection of seeds, corn, squash, and beans, stored in airtight clay jars. Her mother had planned not just for survival, but for a future, for a life to be lived here. While organizing the shelves, her fingers brushed against a loose stone in the back of a deep recess. It was different from the others, slightly smaller and set with a thin line of dried mud around its edges. Curious, she pried at it with the tip of a knife. It came free, revealing a dark, hollow space behind it. Reaching inside, her hand closed around the cold, smooth wood of a small chest. It was made of dark, polished cedar, bound with iron straps, and it was locked. A fresh search began, this time for a key. She looked everywhere, in the pockets of the spare coat hanging on a peg, in the tins of coffee and tea, under the mattresses of the cots. Nothing. Finally, exhausted, she sat down on a cot and picked up one of the heavy wool blankets, the one from the top of the pile. As she ran her hands over it, she felt a small, hard lump sewn into the corner hem. With trembling fingers, she used her knife to carefully snip the thick threads. A small, ornate iron key fell into her palm. It was the moment of discovery. She carried the key and the chest to the table, the pale light from the ceiling fissure illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The key slid into the lock with a soft, metallic click. She lifted the heavy lid. The chest was divided into two compartments. On one side, nestled in a bed of faded velvet, was a heavy leather pouch tied with a drawstring. She lifted it, surprised by its weight, and loosened the knot. A stream of dull, gray-blue stones tumbled onto the table, clicking softly against the wood. They were uncut and unpolished, but even in the dim light, they held a deep, captivating color. Sapphires. Dozens of them, some as small as a pea, others as large as a robin's egg. On the other side of the chest lay two items: a thick journal bound in worn leather, and a single folded document, yellowed with age and tied with a faded red ribbon. Clara set the pouch of stones aside and reverently picked up the journal. It was her mother's. The handwriting was the same neat, careful script she had seen on countless lists for supplies. But here, the words flowed with a different purpose. She opened to the first page. "My dearest Clara," it began. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and the world has shown you its colder side, as I always feared it might. But do not be afraid. This place is yours now. Everything here, I did for you." Clara read on, page after page, the story of her mother's secret life unfolding. Eleanor had not been born to a life of laundry. Her father had been a prospector, and she had spent her childhood in mining camps, learning to read the land, to recognize the signs of gold, silver, and gemstones. After her first husband, Clara's father, had died, she had returned to the only skill she had left from that life. She had begun exploring the high creeks in secret, panning in her few stolen hours of freedom. And in this creek, the one that fed the waterfall, she had found them. The sapphires. The journal detailed years of patient work. A few stones gathered each trip, carried back in secret, and added to the cache. She described how she had used a handful of the smaller, less valuable stones, sold quietly in a town 100 miles away, to buy the stove, the tools, the rifle, and the supplies, hauling them up to the cave piece by piece over 5 years. But it was the document tied with the ribbon that held the greatest secret. Clara carefully untied the knot and unfolded the paper. It was a legal mineral claim, properly filed and stamped by the Montana Territorial Land Office in Helena, dated 6 years prior. It claimed, for mining purposes, the entire length of the creek, from its source in the high peaks down to the waterfall, and 100 yards of land on either side. The name on the claim was not Silas Croft's, it was Eleanor Winslow's, and as her sole heir, it now belonged to Clara. Her mother hadn't just found a few pretty stones. She had discovered and legally secured one of the richest sapphire deposits in the territory. The laundress, the quiet, overlooked woman, had outsmarted them all. The final entry in the journal was dated only a few months before Eleanor's death. The claim is secure. The shelter is ready. I hope you never need it, my sweet girl. I hope your life is soft and easy. But if it is not, know that I have left you a foundation. I have left you the earth itself. Build your life on this rock, Clara. Be strong, be smart, and never ever let anyone make you feel small. Your loving mother, Eleanor. Clara closed the journal, holding it to her chest. The sapphires on the table were not just wealth, they were a legacy. The claim was not just a piece of paper, it was a declaration of independence. Her mother had given her more than a refuge. She had given her power. The first days after the discovery were a blur of reading and planning. Clara absorbed every word of her mother's journal, which was not only a chronicle of her life but also a detailed manual. Eleanor had recorded the best places along the creek to pan, the specific type of gravel that yielded the most stones, and her own self-taught methods for building a simple but effective sluice box to speed up the process. The journal was a final set of lessons from her mentor. Clara understood that the sapphires in the chest were a starting fund, but the true value lay in the creek itself and the legal paper that gave her ownership of it. Her first priority was to ensure the claim was recognized as hers. The world of men, laws, and property was a foreign and intimidating one, but her mother's final words echoed in her mind. Be smart. She knew she could not simply walk into Flat Creek and declare her inheritance. Silas and his sons would try to take it from her. Others would see a young, lone woman as an easy target. She needed an ally, someone who understood this world. The journal provided one. In a few entries, her mother mentioned an old prospector named Jedediah Stone, a man she had trusted enough to ask for advice on filing the claim. Jed is a man as solid as his name, Eleanor wrote. He keeps his own counsel and judges people by their grit, not their station. He lived, according to the journal, in a small cabin a day's walk downriver, far from any settlement. Clara packed a small bag with food, the claim document, the journal, and a handful of the smaller sapphires. She secured the cave, camouflaging the entrance behind the waterfall even more carefully, and set off to find him. Jedediah Stone's cabin was exactly as described. A small, tidy structure of chinked logs with a plume of smoke rising from its stone chimney. Jed himself was a man who seemed carved from the mountain, with a wild gray beard, hands like gnarled roots, and eyes the pale, clear blue of a winter sky. He was wary when she approached, his hand resting on the handle of an old pistol tucked into his belt. Clara did not waste words. "My name is Clara Winslow," she said, her voice steady. "My mother was Eleanor Winslow." The name got his attention. His eyes narrowed, studying her face. "I see her in you," he said after a long moment, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He gestured toward the cabin. "Come in out of the wind." Inside, she told him her story, laying the claim document and the journal on his table. He listened without interruption, his gaze fixed on the papers. He picked up one of the sapphires she offered, turning it over in his calloused fingers, holding it up to the light. "Yogo sapphires," he murmured, a note of reverence in his voice. "The best in the territory. Your mother was a sharp one, a real sharp one." He confirmed her fears. Her claim was legal and binding, but it would be challenged. She needed to go to the county seat in Junction City, not Flat Creek, and have the inheritance legally transferred and recorded with the territorial registrar. He gave her practical, specific advice. "Don't show all your cards, girl. Don't show them the big stones. Take a few of the medium ones, enough to prove the claim is productive, enough to pay the fees and buy what you need. Keep the rest hidden. Wealth makes people foolish, and foolish people are dangerous." He then did something more. He drew her a map to Junction City, marking a safe route, and gave her the name of the registrar, a man named Abernathy he knew to be fair. "Tell him Jed Stone sent you," he said. "It might not help, but it won't hurt." The journey to Junction City took 2 days. It was a larger, busier town than Flat Creek, and Clara felt a knot of anxiety in her stomach. But she held her head high, walking with the confidence her mother's legacy had given her. Mr. Abernathy was a stern-faced man with spectacles and an air of weary bureaucracy. He looked at Clara with skepticism, but when she mentioned Jed Stone's name and presented her mother's original claim and death notice, his demeanor shifted to one of professional diligence. He verified the documents against the territorial records, his pen scratching as he made notes. "The claim is in order," he announced finally, peering at her over his glasses. "The transfer of title to you as the sole heir is straightforward." He did not pry or ask how a laundress's daughter came to possess such a thing. He simply did his job. The law, for once, was on her side. With the legalities settled, Clara's rebuilding began in earnest. She sold 3 of the mid-sized sapphires to the town assayer, a transaction she navigated with the shrewdness Jed had advised. The sum she received was more money than she had ever seen in her life. It was not a fortune, but it was a foundation. She did not squander it. She bought a sturdy pack mule, a new set of high-quality mining tools, picks, shovels, and a set of classifying screens, and enough provisions to last for months. Her last stop was the blacksmith's shop to order a custom-fitted grate for her sluice box. The blacksmith's wife, a kind, sturdy woman named Martha Gable, saw the quiet determination in the young woman's eyes. Seeing that Clara had nowhere to stay, she offered her a room for the night and a hot meal, a simple act of generosity that felt monumental. "You look like a girl who knows her own mind," Mrs. Gable said, ladling stew into a bowl. "The world needs more of that." Clara returned to the mountains not as a fleeing orphan, but as a homesteader, an entrepreneur. The mule, laden with supplies, followed her patiently up the trail. She had faced the world of men and laws and had not been found wanting. The physical rebuilding started the next day. Following her mother's diagrams, she began constructing a sluice box near the creek, a long wooden trough with riffles to catch the heavy sapphires. Jed Stone appeared a week later, as if by instinct, and silently helped her, his expertise invaluable. He showed her how to position the box to get the best water flow, how to secure it against the spring runoff. They worked together in comfortable silence, their communication based on the shared language of practical work. He was the first member of her new, small community. The work was grueling, but deeply satisfying. Each shovelful of gravel washed through the sluice was an act of creation, of building her future. And at the end of each day, as she cleaned the riffles, she would find them. Small, beautiful glints of blue and gray, her mother's legacy made real, gathered from the cold mountain water. The cave, once a desperate refuge, slowly transformed into a true home. With the money from her first sale of sapphires, Clara had purchased not just tools and provisions, but small comforts as well. A proper mattress for her cot, a few books, kerosene for a brighter lamp, and a small cast-iron cook stove that she installed in place of the more primitive pot-bellied heater. The scent of baking bread soon mingled with the clean, earthy smell of the cavern. She built sturdy shelves, a new table, and a comfortable chair. Her carpentry skills, learned from mending fences and furniture with her mother, proving surprisingly adept. The cave became a place of warmth and order, a sanctuary of her own making. News of the Winslow claim traveled slowly at first, a rumor carried by a traveling tinker who had heard whispers in Junction City. When it finally reached Flat Creek, it was met with disbelief, then scorn, and finally, a simmering, covetous anger. Silas Croft and his sons were the most vocal. They declared it was a fraud, that Eleanor had never been smart enough to file a claim, that Clara must have stolen it or tricked some fool into signing it over. They rode to Junction City to challenge it, but Mr. Abernathy, armed with the law and his own meticulous records, sent them away with a curt dismissal. The claim was ironclad. Defeated and humiliated, their resentment toward Clara hardened into a bitter poison. But others in the territory had a different reaction. Prospectors and miners, who understood the value of a good strike and the luck and labor it required, regarded her with a grudging respect. They began to speak of the Winslow sapphires and the girl in the waterfall cave. She became a local legend, a figure of mystery and admiration. Her quiet solitude and the natural fortress of her claim protected her. Few were willing to brave the rugged terrain to bother her, and those who did found a young woman who was polite but firm, her rifle never far from her side, her eyes clear and steady. She was not to be trifled with. Her small community, founded on quiet acts of practical generosity, began to grow. Jedediah Stone became a regular visitor, arriving every few weeks with news from the outside world and a pouch of tobacco to share. He never offered unsolicited advice, but would answer her questions about mining, the weather, and the changing seasons with the wisdom of a man who had spent a lifetime reading the Book of the Mountains. Martha Gable from Junction City would send packages for her with the mail carrier, who traveled a route 20 miles to the south. A new novel, a jar of her spiced apple butter, a warm knitted scarf for the winter. These small connections were anchors, reminding Clara that she was not entirely alone. Small rituals began to shape her days. She would rise before the sun, start the coffee, and walk to the creek in the crisp morning air. She worked the sluice box through the daylight hours, the rhythm of shovel and water becoming a kind of meditation. In the evenings, she would sit by her stove, sorting the day's haul of sapphires, reading her mother's journal, or writing in her own. The unwanted cave had become her castle, her workshop, and her refuge. The stream was no longer just a source of water, but the source of her livelihood, her independence. People in the territory knew her name now. She was no longer Eleanor's forgotten daughter or Silas's unwanted stepchild. She was Clara Winslow, the owner of Sapphire Creek. The title was not one of nobility, but it was one of substance, earned through her mother's foresight and her own relentless labor. It was a position of respect, built not on declarations or fancy things, but on the solid, functional reality of her work, her claim, and the warm, purposeful life she had carved out for herself, deep in the heart of the mountains. One evening in late autumn, as the first snows began to dust the highest peaks, Clara stood at the entrance of her cave, looking out through the shimmering veil of the waterfall. The sun was setting, painting the sky in strokes of fiery orange and deep violet, the colors reflected in the turbulent water of the plunge pool. A profound sense of peace settled over her, a quiet contentment that felt as solid and real as the stone at her back. She had spent the day building a small, sturdy cabin just outside the cave entrance, on a flat ledge overlooking the creek. It wasn't large, just a single room to serve as a proper living space, leaving the cave for storage and as a workshop. The scent of freshly cut pine from the new walls filled the air. This was hers. Not just the sapphires, not just the claim, but this life, this place, this quiet moment of peace. She turned and went back inside, the cave warm and inviting from the heat of the cook stove. On the new mantelpiece she had built over the stone hearth, two objects sat side by side. One was the soft, creased scrap of deerskin, its map now a treasured artifact, a symbol of the journey that had brought her here. Next to it sat a single, magnificent sapphire she had found in her mother's chest. It was a deep, cornflower blue, perfectly formed and shaped like a heart. Eleanor had set it aside, a silent message of love. Clara looked at the two objects, the map that had guided her and the heart that had been waiting for her, and saw the full arc of her mother's story. Eleanor Winslow was not the woman Flat Creek had known. She was not a simple laundress defined by her labor, nor a victim defined by her losses. She was a strategist, a provider, a quiet revolutionary who had played the long game and won. She had seen the contempt in men like Silas Croft and had built her daughter a fortress against it, not of anger or revenge, but of stone and water and legal ink. She had armed Clara with skills, with knowledge, and with a tangible inheritance that could never be taken away. She thought of Silas and his sons, trapped in their small cabin and their even smaller lives, their greed having left them with nothing but the bitter ashes of resentment. They had cast her out with $5, believing they were ridding themselves of a burden. They had no idea they were setting her free. Her mother's love had been a hidden current, running deep and silent beneath the surface of their hard life, and it had carried her here, to this place of safety and strength. Clara Winslow was 19 when her family cast her out with $5 and a worn carpet bag. She had nothing to her name but a deerskin map and a legacy she didn't yet understand. She followed that map into the mountains and spent her last dollar on the fees to claim her birthright. It was the best money she ever spent. For those of you who have stayed with us through Clara's journey, we thank you. If her story of resilience and hidden strength moved you, please consider sharing it with someone who might find inspiration in it, and subscribe for more tales of quiet courage. We leave you with this question. What hidden maps have been left for you, and what undiscovered country might they lead to in your own life?